to think, perchance to dream, said Shakespeare. He wasn't talking about the Schemel Forum, but I hope that the Schemel Forum, perchance, has given us the opportunity to think and dream. The couple of hours of our time that we come together to think, to dream, and to express ourselves to others have been special in our lives, and I hope it will continue. Today we have with us the person who has put us in this position, who has given us the opportunity to think and sometimes dream together. Harmar Brereton planted the seed in inviting some of his colleagues to come together, some of them are here, and discuss matters that took them away from their professional conversations to think about and discuss other matters of interest. And so the seeds of the Schemel Forum were planted. We have Harmar to thank for these years of discussion, and he is here, and then we can thank him in person. Harmar, please.
Thank you, Sandra.
Success.
Thank you, Sandra. Thank you, Sandra. Is my microphone working? Can you all hear? Okay, great. I must say, you really come home, and I see all of you. I can't see many of you, but I can see you with my heart, and I know that I'm home. And I run into Charlie Bannon, who so many years ago gave me my job here, to Joe Caesar, who 20 years ago replaced my left hip, and to Tom Chirilla, who 10 years ago took over my practice. So you really come home when you see these wonderful people and everybody in between. So thank you for coming, and thank you, Sandra, for the introduction. And the Schemel Forum honors George Schemel, a great Jesuit mentor of mine. And so it's a pleasure to come back in his name this is probably the last presentation which I'll be able to give. So to do that in his honor as well. And I'd like to thank my wife, Leslie, because without her interest in music, these questions would never have come to me. But having been married to Leslie for almost 57 years, and to realizing how important music is to her, and to have a musical education living with her, has raised the questions that I have. What is music? Where did it come from? Why does it affect us so? And in some ways, this is predicated on the conversations all of us have had before that we raised on Paleolithic cave painting and human consciousness. What is human consciousness? What are the artistic manifestations of consciousness? So this is an appendage or related to those earlier conversations, and many of you have had that pleasure to go through that with me in the past. But let's start with the origin of music. I'll answer the question in the first slide. Well, it's the human voice. But that poses many other questions. What is music? And what is the voice? So we'll deal with those and many other topics as we go through this today. And I think I'm rescued by the quote, music is the human behavior least susceptible to explanation. That makes it easier for me to wander and to avoid the critique that you might otherwise apply. The five basic human senses, and I begin with sound because sound's going to be so important to us today. Sound, sight, smell, taste, and touch. And then there are many other senses that we have, and I've listed a few there. Balance, temperature, proprioception, pain, many different receptors in the eye, the rods and the cones. But these are the five basic classical senses, and I put sound first. And sound and sight are the two that we do at a distance. And sound, remember, you can hear when you can't see. You can hear at night. You can see around the corner. Sound is incredibly important for us as to who we have become as human beings in our evolution. And that includes sound as it's modified as music. And so we're going to, I think, have an appreciation for the importance of music in our evolution as Homo sapiens as we go through today's presentation. And that's the reason I put sound as the first of our senses. This is a very ambitious outline, but we'll get through it, and I think it'll be fun for a lot of you. In the first part, we're going to talk about creation. I was thinking of Paul Fahey when I put this part together. And Paul, I'm going to depend on you to correct me and to help me get through this. But we're going to talk about creation and the original atmosphere, iron, oxygen, and the energy source that drives our voice. Where do we get the energy for that? We're going to talk about the anatomic evolution. Did we evolve from sponges or jellyfish? And right now I can see many of you thinking of relatives that you have. Saying, I just wonder if I'm in the mainstream of human evolution or not. We'll talk about lungs, larynx, hearing, brain, and feet. What do feet have to do with the voice, except that same relative may, in fact, have had his foot in his mouth. But there's another and fascinating explanation why feet are important in the development of our voice. We'll talk about creation of sound. I'd like to linger here for a moment because you'll all get this very quickly. Volume, pitch, rhythm, timbre, and prosody are all non-linguistic ways in which we modify sound. Volume, loud and soft. Pitch, high and low. Rhythm, slow and fast. Timbre, the way we tell an oboe from a clarinet. And prosody, the context within which the sound occurs. All inform the sound in ways that are not linguistic, they're not language, and yet they tell us an enormous amount about what's going on. And you see how this might be so important for us in our understanding of music. A good example of prosody might be if I were to take the phrase O-H, O, and pronounced it in 3 different ways, you'd understand immediately what I'm saying. Suppose I said O, or O, or O. I said 3 different things, all with the same sound, and you know what they mean. And all of that's pre-linguistic. It's fascinating how much those kinds of subtleties, as well as body language, facial language, impart to our understanding of the sound that we make without language. We'll then talk a little bit about hominin evolution and how consciousness, which is a summary of both biological and cultural influences, and we'll talk about that. We'll see what we inherit biologically, but then what culturally modifies that in our consciousness. We'll see where music fits. It's quite fascinating. And at the very end, and throughout the talk, we'll talk a little bit about how music and language are related. The origin of music begins with the human voice, and I think another way of putting this is to say symbolically meaningful vocalizing. Not just making a sound, but making a sound that has a symbolic connotation, and that's important. Music then extends to the human use of instruments. We'll show an example of what that looks like, but that only begins about 40 to 60,000 years ago, which is about when language starts, our capacity to speak. So language and the production of instruments is about simultaneous. But my argument is going to be that music is far older than that, and we'll see how that goes. And then we'll talk a little bit about how language informs and shapes music. The human voice is a product of many different parts of our anatomy. Larynx, of course, but lungs, ear, brain, mouth, tongue, and of course, the foot. And after that, we'll talk about some of the instruments that were created, beginning with flutes, drums, and string, and I'll show you an ancient flute, which is really quite beautiful. And there's a correlate about the same time when we started to have our full level of consciousness and to speak. But let's begin at the beginning. That at creation, 18.6 billion years ago, when energy was converted to mass in the most remarkable and beautiful event. We couldn't get a picture of that because we couldn't see it. We call it the Big Bang, but there was no sound, there was no atmosphere in which to carry those sound waves. So this is the best we can do. A picture 380,000 years after creation from a satellite that shows us what the universe looked like at that time. And as the plasma of creation starts to consolidate into subatomic particles, and then ultimately helium and hydrogen, the 2 elements that you see labeled there, That's where we're going to start in our conversation. And here's where it goes. This is a picture taken later of an image from the Webb satellite of the earliest galaxies. And this is important because it's in these galaxies and how stars coming together in supernovas create the temperature and pressure within which to form all the heavier elements, not just hydrogen and helium. But in this beautiful creative moment, we are now establishing other elements and building blocks of life, which include the heavier elements. The two that I want to talk about are oxygen and iron, and you'll see how they're important in our story of the development of music and the voice. Oxygen first. There was no oxygen in the atmosphere to begin with. We now have 21% of our atmosphere is oxygen. But the oxygen came as it was concentrated 2.5 billion years ago by blue-green algae because of the invention, the creative invention of chlorophyll, which is a molecule, and we'll show how that works momentarily. But it allowed huge increases in energy production with mitochondria, and with the oxygen available in the atmosphere, encouraged life to emerge from the sea. Once we have enough oxygen in the atmosphere, and mitochondria to use the oxygen to generate much more energy than we could otherwise, all of that's outside the sea, and we're encouraging life to leave the sea. And it was necessary for us to develop a voice, to develop music. And iron. Iron has two critical roles for us. It sits in the Earth's core, and with rotation of the Earth around that iron core, we have a magnetic field that protects us from solar radiation. And without that protection, we could not exist. But secondly, iron is the critical element in heme that allows that molecule to carry oxygen to our tissues to keep us growing and alive, and carbon dioxide back from those tissues to expel through the lungs. So we see oxygen and iron created in the Big Bang, or in the explosion, if you will, of a type 1a supernova that creates these heavy elements. I'm reminded of giving a talk to the medical students on the creation, or on how we make heme. And in the last part of that, of course, where does the iron come from? The medical students are great. They say, oh, green leafy vegetables. And they've taken their nutrition lecture. And I say, where do they get that? Oh, they get that from the ground. And then when the final answer, where does the ground get it? And the answer comes from the type 1a supernova that created it and blew it across the universe. Then I'm thinking of Sagan's great comment, we are children of the stars. And that humility and beauty should be part of this conversation. Here's how it works. This is a this is a chloroplast or chlorophyll. I can't use a pointer around here, but I can tell you where to look. If you look at the bottom, you'll see how water and carbon dioxide come together to make sugar, and the byproduct is oxygen. Well, that's how we oxygenated our atmosphere. There was none to begin with. But blue-green algae do this for us. And it took, of course, an awful long time. It was called the Great Oxygen Event. It took a long time, however, for that to happen. But we have oxygen now in the atmosphere because of chlorophyll. And we use that oxygen in mitochondria, which can then take the oxygen and use that to metabolize sugar to generate energy in far higher quantities. So as I say on the right, oxygen consumed with ATP, that's our energy source, that is generated. And here's how it looks. If you look on the left, you'll see how energy is generated without oxygen. And at the bottom, you'll see two energy sources of ATP. On the right, it's 36. So it's an 18-fold increase in energy consumption as long as you could use oxygen. A huge advantage for the creatures that lived in the sea, and a big incentive, if you will, for them to leave the sea, to have access to that additional energy for growth and for survival. Here's what the iron's doing in the center of our planet. It sits there in an iron core, and then with the rotation of the planet around that, we have the protective magnetic field that I described. And here's the iron, it's abbreviated Fe2, sitting in the middle of a heme atom. This is a beautiful tetramer of heme as it comes together and holds the iron there. And the iron has the opportunity to be either +2 or +3 as it takes oxygen to or carbon dioxide away from the tissues. It's beautifully constructed for its purpose. But take a look at this. Look at the comparison of chlorophyll and heme. Isn't it remarkable? On the left, you see chlorophyll with a central atom of magnesium, which is used by plants, and then you look at heme on the right with the central atom of iron. When nature has a great idea, she uses it again and again and again. And here we see a perfect example of that, and we'll think about it again in other situations later on. The New York Times asked the question a few years ago, are we descended from sponges or from jellyfish? It's a fascinating question, and I'll go to the last sentence, which says, the answer has ramifications that transcend science and move to philosophy, which I agree with. But if you go back and look at the DNA of all the creatures between us and the origin, it's probably, these are the jellyfish, but we are descended from sponges. But sponges grow and emerge and mutate into other creatures. This, of course, is in the sea. And so we're going to move to other creatures that have evolved from sponges, and we'll take a look. Now that we have oxygen in the environment and iron capable of moving it, we want to take advantage of this and we have to leave the sea. So how are we going to do that? On this slide, which is basically 500 million years ago, I've shown two things. The top arrow is a freshwater lungfish, and the second bottom arrow is Tiktaalik. Both of them have great stories. The top one is the beginning of our lung and larynx, and the bottom one is the shift from a fin to a foot. In other words, how do we leave the sea? Let's take a look at how this works. Here's the anatomy of a freshwater lungfish. It's fascinating how this occurred. This only occurred in freshwater lungfish, and the reason for that is that if a fish who lived in water had the misfortune of being in a pond that evaporated, that fish was stuck out of water. Never happens in the sea. Fish in the sea don't have that problem, but freshwater fish do. And if you ran out of water, somehow you had to get oxygen, and if you couldn't get it through the water, through your gills, a mutation of a gill membrane was the beginning of our lung. And then when the water comes back into that evaporated pool, the lungfish can go back and forth. And interestingly enough, the lungfish can shift its circulation from a gill to a lung, depending on whether it's submerged or whether it's in dry land. So the beginning of our lung is with the mutated gill of a freshwater lungfish. Turns out there's still 6 varieties of a freshwater lungfish on the earth today, as far away as Australia, Africa, and other places, so they survive. But that was the beginning of our lung. This is also a swim bladder, which is another mutation of that structure, and the swim bladder helped to keep the lungfish upright. But the problem with that device is that it had to have a hole. And through that hole, it could bring in air. But the problem is that if that hole was left permanently open, or if you couldn't close it, a wave would come by and swamp it. So through the evolutionary pressure of that risk, a flap was developed over the opening in the hole of the lung of the freshwater lungfish, and it was that flap that became the beginning of our larynx. So we have a lung, the lung from the gill mutation for oxygen utilization on land, and the swim bladder mutation for flotation, and we have a larynx. Both needed protection from flooding, and the evolution of a flap that gradually evolves into a larynx is how it started. Here's a picture of the lungfish taking a gulp of air. And here's one stranded in dry land, but doing fine because of its mutated gill into a lung. But how do we move from the sea to the land? The lungfish didn't want to be there. It was stuck there because of evaporation. But there's a huge advantage to wanting to be there because of the oxygen available, and the mutations which now offer us the capacity to generate huge amounts of energy. So we have to have a modification of a fin to a foot. Neil Shubin was an anthropologist from the University of Pennsylvania, and he estimated that that mutation had to occur about 375 million years ago. And this is one of the great stories of fossil hunting. But on the last day of the last week, of the last month, of the last year of Dr. Shubin's grant, he was about to run out and leave northern Canada, where he had determined that these rocks existed on the surface. One of his students said, "Hey, Neil, I see a nose coming out of the rock." And the nose, instead of being like this, as it would as a fish, it was like this, like a reptile. And so this was the fossil that they had discovered. Fully dissected from the rock, here's what it looks like. And Neil decided to name it Tiktaalik, which was a native Canadian name for ancient reptile. So Tiktaalik represents the transition from fish to reptile, the movement from fin to foot, which allowed us, our forebears, to leave the sea and to reach the land, where the capacity for energy generation with all of that oxygen was available for growth and for preservation. You can see, if you go from the left to the right, we have a fin on the left, a foot on the right, and Tiktaalik in the middle. This is transitional. And on this picture, going again from left to right, you have the fin, Tiktaalik is in the middle somewhere, and then the human arm is on the right. So we're doing pretty well. We're out of the sea, but we need to further develop our lung, and this occurred about 220 million years ago. And there are all kinds of interesting evidence on the fossils of how this happened. But it turns out that we need to have an expanded chest capacity. So the nerves from the chest to the lung, to expand the chest, have to increase in size from what they had been. And we see all of this happening, as well as the development of a diaphragm. So we now have increased volume and control of air through the larynx. We now have a bellows, which is adequate for the task of not only breathing, but sound producing. About 65 million years ago, this fossil was recently discovered, and I noted it from just a couple of months ago in the New York Times. Ankylosaurus was a creature that lived, but the good news is, and you can see pictured there where the larynx normally would be, the larynx was actually fossilized and dissected from this animal, and you can see how closely this appears to be to our larynx. So we're well on our way to a modern hominid or human larynx. Now, why the foot? Perhaps you've wondered about, why do we have the foot in here? When we go from quadruped to biped mobility, that is a critical step, not only for us, but for the evolution of our voice. When we had to leave the trees because of a change in climate, and we had to move across the savanna, 2 feet are much better than 4. It's energy conserving. We can go much farther, not quite as fast, but we can ultimately outrun any creature on the savanna because we can run longer than they can. And when we're on 2 feet, we also have 2 arms with which we can do other things. So there are great advantages to standing upright and using our arms. But to be able to do that, our foot had to change. And the foot had to change in a couple of interesting ways. We no longer have the same opposing great toe that our chimpanzee and gorilla and bonobos relatives have. That's 6 million years ago. The toe now functions, the great toe functions like a toe. And also, we push off from the ball of our foot, we have an arch. So the character of our foot is greatly different from our cousins, chimpanzees and gorillas, so that we can run across the savanna and stand upright. But standing upright did something else. It allowed our larynx to drop from the neck into the chest. as I say on the left. This allows the descent of the larynx, eliminating our capacity to simultaneously breathe and swallow. But it increased the chamber of vocalizing, which was critical for us. Now, those of you who have observed a newborn baby realize that they can breathe and swallow at the same time. Baby can nurse and breathe at the same time. The reason for that is that the larynx is still high up in the neck. But once that larynx starts to drop down into the chest, it can no longer do that. Now, you would think that's the loss of a very advantageous capacity. What could possibly replace it? And what replaces it is a better sound chamber for the human voice, which turns out to be more valuable for our survival than the capacity to breathe and swallow at the same time. So that's the reason the foot gets its place in the evolution of our larynx. It was critical to our upright posture, which allowed the larynx to drop from the neck into the chest. So here's what our vocal cords look like. As you can see on the left and the upper, the vocal cords are closed, and just below that, they're open. But it's not the vocal cords that are making any noise. It's the column of air that's vibrating, much like we make when we blow a trumpet. All those vocal cords do is change the size, if you will, of the chamber within which the sound is being made. And on the right, you can see the tongue and the lips, and as I have said in the script on the right, the lip and the tongue development helps us to manipulate the sound. So all of these characteristics have allowed us to make the kind of sound that is so valuable and useful for us today. The beginning of music and also language, but this is how it started. One interesting feature here is how is our larynx innervated? What's the nerve that works the larynx? It's called the vagus nerve, the 10th cranial nerve. And the interesting feature is it's one nerve, monosynaptic, one nerve. No other hominin has that. Chimpanzees and gorillas don't have it. None of the other creatures that are related to us, gibbons, vervets, whatever, they do not have a single nerve that connects their brain with their larynx. That's critical for our ability to make the sound that we do, to make the sound that we might hear. And you can see in this picture that that nerve, a single nerve, superior laryngeal and inferior laryngeal nerves go to the larynx, one nerve. But there's one more step that we have to take in the creation of our sound chamber, and that is, here's our ear. You can see the ear at the top, and at the bottom is our balance center. The balance center sits just inside the ear. But what happens when we go from walking on all fours to upright? We're now on two legs. Well, the balance center has to rotate 90 degrees to accurately give us information about our posture and where we are. And in so doing, it opens up the nasopharynx, which is the last step in the creation of this sound chamber that's allowing me to talk and all of us to talk and make the sound, the music and the language that we are doing. So with upright posture, the ear and the balance mechanism rotates 90 degrees, increasing our sound chamber. Let's turn now to the nerves and how we hear the sound and what's happening. I think you can see from here we have the ear with the nerve going directly into the midbrain. I'm sorry I don't have a pointer here, and I'll try to tell you where I'm looking so your eye can be drawn to this. But the point I'm wanting to make here is that the midbrain is a more ancient structure of our brain. It's much older, but that's the emotional center of our brain. And just think, that's how sound is coming into our emotional center, long before we have the frontal cortex, which is our logic and language and thought process. It's into our emotional center that those sounds are coming. And it's that emotional center that may be used for us to create sound for a long, long time, long before we become fully conscious or become capable of language. Here's another picture of that middle portion of our brain called the limbic system. I'm sorry I can't point to this, but I think you can see that it's the middle structure, which is far older than our cortex and the emotional center of our brain. And this image here will help the most. As you can see, the lower portion is the where we have reflexes is the brain stem. And of course, we share that portion of our brain with all creatures, amphibians, reptiles, all of them. But you move up into the emotion, the limbic system, where I have the word music on the left. I'm using music and that kind of sound and emotion coming in to influence our development and our consciousness as far older than more differentiated consciousness of language would offer. And then the top, of course, is where language and logic resides in the cortical portion of the brain. The origin of consciousness is a very interesting topic, but there's no good definition for consciousness, and I'll persuade you, I think, when I give you a couple of definitions that we have. But brain development, the anatomic and the neurologic leading to consciousness, you can understand how complex it is when the cerebral cortex contains 10 billion neurons, all of which are connected. And the limbic system, which down below that, important for all the emotional capacity that we have, are all interconnected. And the thalamocortical system tries to connect it all. It's incredibly complicated. These are the three definitions of consciousness that I'm going to offer. One from Webster, one from Cambridge, and the other from the Oxford Dictionary. I've emphasized the words that are common or important: awareness, perception, concern, awareness, understanding, realizing, aware, mind's awareness of itself. Does any of that help you? I don't think so. The one that I like the most is from the Cambridge Dictionary: the state of understanding and realizing something. Well, that's just about as vague as you could be, but that's about what we understand from consciousness. Consciousness, as we define it, is capable of symbolic thinking and speaking. We'll talk about what a symbol is and how that works. But that's the best that we can get. That's the best we can do when it comes to defining consciousness. But I wanted to put it in here in our conversation of music because music and consciousness will have some relationship. Symbol and symbolic behavior are essential characteristics of consciousness. We all intuitively know what symbols are, but they're a mark, sign, or word or sound that indicates or signifies or is understood as representing an idea, object, or relationship. We all use symbols all the time in our lives, every day. The stop sign that we have, the cross on the church, the sign, the Star of David in our synagogue. All of these are profoundly meaningful symbols that we take for granted because they mean so much to us. Symbolic behavior is the ability to represent objects, people, and abstract concepts with arbitrary symbols, vocal, sung, or spoken, or visual, and to reify symbols in cultural practice. But the point I would like us to take away from this slide is that human consciousness, the full human consciousness, is predicated on our ability to symbolize, and nobody else, no other creature can do that. The model for the evolution of human consciousness I like the best is Stephen Mithen's, and I will share it with you right now. Stephen has a really terrific way of thinking about this. And he says there are four consciousnesses that we have, or four intelligences that we have: social, technical, natural history, and linguistic. Let me define these for you. A social intelligence. We all know the hierarchy in the family. Who's mom, who's dad, who's up, who's down, who's the alpha, who's not. That social context is available not just to human beings, but really to all creatures. What about technical intelligence? Well, we can make little arrowheads, and a chimpanzee can take a stick and get some termites out of a mound. So there's a lot of technical capacity that other creatures besides us have. What about natural history intelligence? Well, we all know when it's safe to go to the water hole, when the lions are not there. So these are intelligences which Mithen says we all had as more earlier hominins. But it wasn't until the linguistic intelligence came, and then the question is, when did that come, we pulled all of this together, and he does this in the next model here. As you can see in this model, it sort of looks like a church. The different kinds of intelligences, the technical, the natural history, and the social, are all listed there, but it's not till we get to the linguistic intelligence that integrates all of them into a general intelligence that you have the evolution of human modern consciousness. And he thinks that probably occurred about 40 to 60,000 years ago. And the only reason we can say that, because we weren't here to hear that conversation, is that the rapid development of technological devices, mainly weapons, but also the artistic competence of those Homo sapiens on cave walls was so extraordinary, as we've seen both in Europe and now in Indonesia, is that this explosion of cranial capacity that we call modern human consciousness probably occurred at the time when we could finally speak and understand one another. Trying to read this here. It says, if music represents symbolically meaningful sound and is preceded by language, that's where I think we need to think about music. That it came long before the capacity for speaking and has influenced the development of our brains and becomes the platform upon which sound as language is ultimately established. There are neurologic correlates of consciousness. What parts of our brain have to be connected? And this slide reminds me just to mention that they're all involved up in the cortex. This slide is an interesting one for me because it tries to date the timing of music, if we can. And I mentioned that vocal communication has been around probably for 2 million years. We don't really know how long. I'll show you a slide later on of a lemur that is singing that will give you some clue as to how this began. But Homo erectus probably emerged around 2 million years ago. When we get up to Neanderthal, which is 500,000 years ago, we do have some fossils of a Neanderthal. We have a hyoid bone, and we have other evidence that the Neanderthal skeleton was capable of doing the things that ours can. So it's possible a Neanderthal could speak or make sounds like we do. But that's the best that I can do. Perhaps it goes back to Homo erectus, which is 2 million years ago. But as we drop down looking at the Middle language spoken, probably that's only about 40 to 60,000 years ago and correlates with painting and sculpture. And written language, which is probably only 5,000 or 6,000 years old, is the most recent development. The fact that we can speak is so important to us and has been around long enough that it is part of our biological brain, our biological consciousness. We are born with a capacity for language. We are not born with a capacity for writing. You can't write a language because of a part of your brain that says this is the language you're going to write and how you do that. The speaking parts of language for us in Broca and Wernicke's areas and other parts of the brain, we have. But the way we write is to conscript a portion of our brain which is used for recognizing faces on the left side, and we then use that for learning how to write, which means as we go about that process, we're less able to recognize faces. So that somebody who doesn't write recognizes faces better than we do and out of both sides of their brain, and we write with the left side of our brain and recognize faces out of the right, and not so well as those that don't write. So that's an example of the adaptation, the plasticity of the brain, and how we have a new task which we haven't evolved long enough to incorporate into our biology, but we've been around language long enough, the spoken language, 40 to 60,000 years, that it is now part of our biological brain. Images that go along with the origin of speaking are artistic representations, and this is called Le Sorcier from a magnificent cave in the Pyrenees called Trois Frères. Leslie and I had the pleasure of being there and meeting the people that owned it. And this creature was described to me as representing so many things in the environment, and the only thing about this creature that is human are the genitalia. So this is an utterly symbolic representation of something important on that cave wall. In the same cave are these footprints, but they're not footprints. They're heel prints. And they're not adult footprints or heel prints. They're adolescent heel prints. Now, why would adolescents be walking on their heels in this room, in this cave room? Well, there was a big spot on the cave wall which identified the most acoustically active part of the cave. And outside the cave was a schist upon which was carved human beings copulating. And inside the cave were two bison mating that were made out of clay and had survived 20,000 years because the atmosphere in the cave had been constant. So the assumption that we can make is that these adolescents were going through some ritual that had something to do with maturity, and they were dancing in some way on their heels. And this is the kind of evidence that we have of very complicated behavior that represents the full development of human consciousness in this one cave. I show you this not because it has anything to do with language or with singing, but to me it's one of the most beautiful artifacts of antiquity. It's 40,000 years old. It's called the Lion Man. I won't read all of this, but it's just beautiful, found just outside of a southern German cave. It took 3 generations of archaeologists to find it. It was interrupted by the Second World War. And they didn't know it was a lion head until the very end. They constructed this, and then finally, the 3rd generation of archaeologists went back, found a few extra pieces. This, by the way, is a mammoth bone. It's carved out of a mammoth bone, and finished making this wonderful creature. Turns out to be a lion on a man's body. Talk about the capacity to symbolize. This is the full representation of human consciousness, which correlates with our ability to speak our language. I promised to show you one musical instrument. This was made about the same time, 40,000 years ago, in a cave in southern Germany. And this is a vulture thigh bone, which has 2 holes in it, which allows you to play it, and it's a perfect pentatonic scale. I've heard people play songs on this. It's extraordinary. And so, Paul, you wonder about how our brains hear sounds that have a vibration that can be related, how the tonic and the dominant can be related by whether it's 3 or 2 vibrations per unit of time. Well, that's inherent to our brains. We know that. And we can hear those kinds of sounds, and we can use those sounds in our creation of music. But we could also do that with an instrument that we can make 40,000 years ago. So we've talked about the dating and the evolution of consciousness to perhaps 40 to 60,000 years ago, and it's possible with the artifacts that we left behind, the tools, the weapons, sculpture, and the painting. But what about dating meaningful sound? And you can see where I'm tugging here, trying to get back to music. This is not language, this is music. How far back can we go? And I don't really know. But I'm going to guess it's a long way before language. And so one of the questions we could ask is, well, how far back can we symbolize? How far back can we go? This is called the Makapansgat pebble. It's probably one of the most valuable artifacts in the British Museum. It's an extraordinary, small piece that has not been changed, has not been changed by human hands. This is exactly the way it came out of the ground, if you will, from whatever volcano spewed this out. Nobody changed this. They didn't paint it, they didn't carve it, that's what it was. But the remarkable thing was, this was found a long way from this other stone, like this, that was seen in Africa. And the other remarkable part of it, it was found in the grave of an Australopithecine. Australopithecus africans picked this up 3 million years ago and took it to his or her grave. Have no idea what was in the mind of that wonderful creature, but if they saw this as symbolic of themselves, as is possible, then I simply offer the possibility that our capacity to symbolize, which is so critical to our understanding of modern human consciousness, went through an evolution even as far back as Australopithecus, which was not in our direct line of evolution anyway. And if human consciousness, modern human consciousness, goes through a process, was it picked up by meaningful sound that we call music, and that lies within our capacity that's far older than our capacity to speak. And so I'm going to ask a question. These are lemurs. I hope this will work. Let's listen to these guys. I'm sorry to cut you guys off. This went a lot longer. Isn't that beautiful? It's extraordinary. Well, lemurs sing to each other. They sing in pairs. So this pair was singing to each other. But lemurs also do something quite interesting. They can break up a unit of time into two parts. That doesn't mean that they have rhythm, but they can begin to have rhythm. And they cannot, it's called entrainment. If we all stood up to sing the Star Spangled Banner, we'd all do it in rhythm, and we'd all do it together. That's entrainment. These creatures can't do that. Only human beings can do that with entrainment. But they have volume, pitch. Do they have rhythm? Timbre and prosody are the other two. They have at least 3 of the 5 characteristics that we've talked about are so important in the creation of a platform for music. Now, this is beautiful sound. I agree. I don't think it's music, but that could be a definition. But that's my definition. But I wanted to share that with you so we could think about how far back our understanding and appreciation of music might go, because our last common ancestor was 63 million years ago for these guys, only on Madagascar. So they asked the question, are non-human animals musical? What about songbirds, parrots, and hummingbirds? By the way, those creatures, those birds, which can make the same sound that you and I can, all are monosynaptic. They have one nerve from the brain to the syrinx where they make the sound. No other creatures do, but they do. It's kind of an interesting prerequisite for the capacity to repeat the kind of sound that they hear. We've already seen or heard lemurs. Gibbons have far more complicated sounds. Seals, whales. When you get into whales, I have trouble. It's tricky. A whale song can be picked up by another pod all the way around the world. They can change their songs. Their songs have different meanings. We don't know what they are. Does a whale have modern consciousness, and are they singing? Is a difficult question. I think not. We can't say that yet, but it's a fascinating learning process that we have before we understand their kinds of communication. And how about elephants? My answer is no. But there is vocal learning of sounds with limited meaning that's not symbolic, and these sounds cannot be rearranged with a new meaning. But it's getting there. I'll give you 2 definitions of music. This is a minimalistic definition. And if I'd given this as the first slide, you all would have had for the ladies in the men's room, because it's about that exciting. But this is the way it was defined in The Origin of Music by Nils. They're notes with specific pitches, intervals, and timbres, combined into phrases that are repeated with additions and deletions, assembled into a series with a particular meter and rhythm. But there's meaning, emotion, and memory. We'll talk a little bit about memory in the next couple of slides. That's a minimalist definition of music. But I'd like to just comment on 3 things down here. The first is motherese. Motherese is a new word, relatively new word, at least for me, of the language that we apply to how we communicate with babies. Have you ever talked to a baby? When Leslie says, "Did you ever realize how ridiculous you sound when you're leaning over our son's crib going, go, bo, choo, bo, so, bo, bo." And I said, well, no, that's the way you talk to a baby. And of course, I was right. Here's the fascinating thing. We call it Mother East. There's no word involved. Volume, pitch, tone, rhythm, and prosody is all there. We're communicating with that child. They can't speak our language, but they come back to us and go, boo, boo, doo, doo, and then their arms go. This is before they can speak. It's universal. Every culture around the world speaks Motherese to its children, and they respond accordingly. That, I think, is very likely an archaic remnant of this capacity to have somewhat meaningful sound in our experience and in our brains and in our consciousness that would correlate with music, but it's not quite yet language. Lullabies are the only common songs to all cultures. So I think Motherese evolves into a lullaby. And then how about tonal languages? About half the 5,000 languages on Earth today are tonal. You can't speak Mandarin Chinese without singing. Homer couldn't present his stories without singing. He had a lyre. So singing with language is a very important way that we still communicate as we modify our modern languages with song. Some of them. Here's another definition of music that I like a little better. It's vocalizing influenced by neurocognitive substrate, allowing us to symbolize, giving us music, symbolically meaningful sound. The capacity to vocalize, I think, is ancient. When does the neurocognitive substrate emerge? Can't tell, but maybe 40 to 60,000 years ago, but it might be much earlier than that. And it emerges with our capacity to symbolize. Can musical culture influence neurocognitive substrate? The answer is yes. We'll show that in just a moment. And the influence of music on the brain development is fascinating. Darwin, I love, because he was so good on so many things. And he said this about music. From music, our capacity for speech evolved through a shaping of emotionally expressive vocal sounds. In that one beautiful sentence, he got it right. The sounds that we hear coming in, going to our emotional centers before we have language to speak, inform us and give us a platform upon which we then subsequently develop full consciousness and the capacity to speak. Again, another Darwin with the red additions here that are mine. Emotional vocal expressions are evolved traits that create all the facial expressions, bodily postures, and vocal sounds, which we recognize as expressive. The voice is efficient in the highest degree. And then he says, we have a universal emotional grammar in our species. This is before language, but the emotional grammar that we all have, because of volume, pitch, rhythm, timbre, and prosody, around the world is common. This is vocalizing through which our capacity to symbolize then becomes music. Here's my take on the emotional grammar of vocalizing. It's very simple. You would come to the same conclusions. Loud is associated with fear or aggression. Soft, soothing or peaceful. High, female. Low is male. Fast, excitement, danger. Slow, quiet, sneaky. Timbre, specific to the voice and identity. I shared with you 3 different ways to say the word O and how that had entirely different meanings. And the prosody of the vocal language, the body language that goes with this. Music has some universals, though, and these are physical principles. Octaves are perceived as the same thing. A low octave or a high octave, they're the same note in all cultures. Octaves are divided into 7 or other pitches. We have 7 for ours. We have rhythms. 2 or 3 is generally what we have. Loud, fast, accelerating, high pitch equals emotional excitement. And vocalizing and movement from infancy, Motherese, and lullabies are common to all of us. I wanted to mention just 3 genes that are involved in music because they are fascinating. And the FOXP2 reminds me to go back to the comment I made earlier with chlorophyll and those chemicals. Once creation comes up with a really good idea, she keeps it. And the FOXP2 gene goes all the way through life, if you will. And we find it in humans as well as songbirds. And it's the first gene found that specializes in the voice. How many mutations there are in the FOXP2 tells us something about the importance and what it's doing. And here I think is fascinating. From mice to chimpanzees, which is 100 million years, there's only one mutation in the FOXP2 gene. But from chimpanzees to humans, which is 6 million years, much shorter time, there are already 2 mutations. This tells you, I think, that our voice is really critical to our survival. And our capacity not only to make sound and to speak, but also to sing is critical to our survival. Steven Pinker called music auditory cheesecake. I think he's dead wrong. It's not a byproduct of evolution. It's central to the evolution of who we are, which gets me to the point music is central to who we are. The SLC6A4 gene is wonderful. Those of you that sing in choirs have this because it's a serotonin-related gene which correlates with choral singing. And the other gene, the AVPR1A, is associated with high musical aptitude, and there are others. The point is that our brains have our bodies have genetic proponents, genetic predispositions to the employment of music to our benefit. There are 4 functions of music. Why do we have it? It regulates a mental or physiological state. We can guess how that goes. It mediates between the self and other. It functions as symbolic. If I sing the Star Spangled Banner to you, you know exactly what it meant. And it helps to coordinate action. These are all aspects of the way music informs and influences our behavior, and it's all pre-linguistic. Why does the brain respond so strongly to music? A very loud sound that might be musical goes right through the brainstem, and we jump back before we have a chance to think about it. There are implicit associations with emotional events. You can think how that goes in your own experience. Emotional contagion from voice-like emotional sounds, how we can get the whole group to be doing the same thing by what we say. The visual imagery that's evoked by music. Episodic memory, the soundtracks of our lives, we all have those. And the musical expectancy patterns of tension and release. These are all ways in which music is critical to our understanding and behavior for all of us. So how important is music? Music activates the same neural pathway through dopamine release as sex and food do. Once you get into that level, I think you're at the understanding of how important music is in our evolutionary history. I'm going to show a couple of slides at the end, and they relate to the flow state. The flow state is a change of the brain within itself. For example, when we're listening to music intently or when we're playing music intently, the configuration of our brain actually changes. We become transfixed, transformed, or in some other way. There are all kinds of metaphors for it, but it's also called a flow state. And these are changes in the neuroelectricity and chemistry of the brain, which is how the brain communicates within itself. And in these flow states, there's a transient hypofrontality. What does that mean? There's a part of our frontal cortex that's self-critical, that's looking at ourselves and always criticizing ourselves. When we get into this flow state, that is damped. It's eliminated. We feel relaxed. We're very happy to be there. We're very creative. That's the brain working within itself to create this flow state. And we'll see that referenced in the last slide I show. And then there are a whole bunch of hormones, all of which are familiar to you, from norepinephrine all the way through to endorphins that are released in different ways through the participation in music. How about the effect of music on the development of the brain? And Darwin again was there, and he said, if I had to live my life again, I would have made it a rule to listen to some music at least once every week. for perhaps the parts of my brain now atrophied would thus have been kept active through use. Good for him. I think he's right. And in fact, here's what happens. Sorry I can't point to this, but I've got a star there with corpus callosum. The corpus callosum is the portion of the brain that connects the two hemispheres together. And in someone who is musically competent and undergoing intense training, the corpus callosum is bigger and better than in mine. And the other star here is the auditory cortex. That's very developed in someone who has lots of musical experience. And finally, this I think is fascinating. The blue area here is the portion of our brain which develops as we go through musical training. But if you take a look at the graph, on the left, if you start the training at age 4, it's far bigger and more complex, that portion of the brain, than if you wait until 14 or 16. In other words, the capacity of the brain to respond to musical training is greatest early on. True for languages too. And this defines the plasticity of the brain, certainly the early brain, and how music can affect how our brain develops. How about the response of hearing music and then remembering music? How does that go? And I think this is absolutely fascinating. I'm sorry I don't have a pointer, but I will try to tell you what you're looking at. This creature here actually is the striatum. It's right in the middle of the brain. And the lower portion of that is called the ventral striatum. And when you first hear something from your ear, the nerves going from your ear into this portion of your brain go to the ventral striatum. And you hear that beautiful music for the first time in the lower portion of this structure. And you decide, that is just beautiful. Then it's stored in your brain. And you go to remember it. Well, the ventral part, the dorsal part of the striatum, is at the top here. And so when you go to remember it, that's the portion that's activated, but you can remember it with the same emotional response as when you heard it the first time. And here's what this looks like. I'm sorry, again, I don't have a pointer. But maybe the best way to look at this is the two pictures of the brain on the right. And the farthest one on the right, you see the little red dot, which is lower than the little red dot, which is higher. Can you see that? Okay. The little red dot that is lower on the right is where you first hear music, and that's the activation of the lower striatum, the ventral striatum. But you then store the music in your cortex, and you remember it. The ventral portion of the striatum is activated, and you remember it exactly as you heard it. So this is how our brain is structured, not only to hear the sound, but to remember the sound. And then there are nerves that go connect to our brain, to our voice. So if we want to repeat that sound, we have that ability. So let me give you a summary of what we've talked about, and then we'll have time for some questions, and then I had a little something for Sandra. Is this right? Yes, this is right. The evolution of the voice, which includes the lungs, larynx, ear, brain, and foot, allows us to make sound, shaped by volume, pitch, rhythm, timbre, and prosody, heard in our emotional or limbic brain early in our hominid evolution, and then, through the capacity of our brain to symbolize, and when, don't know, which then makes vocalizing meaningful, and then turns it into music, which then influences the function and the shape of our brain. I'm going to play for you a piece of music that I find very, very musically meaningful. And then we'll have an interview with the person who is the soloist here with his ideas as we conclude. Let me see if this could work.
But the real part of our conversation today deals with the friendship that we've had
Can you hear this?
and the conversation we've just
Rats.
under.
How do we turn the sound up? How do I turn the sound up? Oh, good for you. Okay, try that.
But the real part of our conversation today deals with the friendship that we've had and the conversation we've just undertaken on the meaning of music. And we've talked about the origins of music, but Slaniber, we've heard you play the Swan so beautifully with an orchestra. And friends of mine, and myself included, cannot hear that without tears. And so the question for you is, on that particular piece of music, the Swan, why does it mean something to us? Why does that move us so deeply? There's no language. There's no words that tell us how to respond. How does music, which is so deep to our consciousness, move us in such profoundly beautiful ways?
I think that's a really beautiful and wonderful question. Very difficult to answer. I'll just give you some of my own musings on the topic. I think that personally as a performer, one of the most interesting things that I find about the process of playing music is that when I'm in a performance, I find myself drawn into what I would describe as a different state of consciousness in my mind. The everyday consciousness, when we use language to interact with people and have a conversation, this is, I think, a very specific, concrete type of consciousness where we're observing the world and taking in things through our senses and making rational decisions and judgments about things. But when I'm playing, and also when I'm really absorbed and listening to something musical that engrosses me, it's an experience where the remainder of one's sensory input just dissolves, and all that's left is this flow, this experience of pure music and emotion. Yeah, and I think one of the things that I know you're very interested in sort of our pre-linguistic understanding of music. One of the things I think that has so much relevance in music is that it's all about motion and change. And I think that before we had language, we could still see the shadows on the ground move as the sun, set, and of course we could interact through the world physically in our bodies. And I think that this is the part of music that appeals to our soul.
How lovely. So it goes back to an archaic part of our consciousness before language, and that moves us in some mysterious ways and touches our soul.
Right.
That is just beautiful. Thank you for concluding our conversation on the origins of music. It couldn't be done in a better way.
Thank you. Thank you for asking.
And I thank you. I see that it's already 1:30, and I'd love to take some questions, but first I wanted to give Sandra a gift, and she can open it here if she doesn't mind, and you all will understand.
I couldn't resist.
You all will understand the significance of this as she does so. It's a little bit delicate in there, Sandra.
I'm sure you're waiting to ask the question. And it isn't what is in here. What is in there?
It's very good. The Swan. So it's my way of saying because this is Sandra's swan song, I wanted you to hear Saint-Saëns' Swan, which was so beautiful and played by a remarkable man, Vladimir Fung, who was a great friend of Leslie's and mine, and who won the Tchaikovsky competition for cello in Russia, the only American and the youngest person ever to win that. And he is so smart, and he understands music, and you heard him use the word flow. You heard him see how his consciousness changes. You saw how in his preparation and presentation of music, he's talking about a different kind of consciousness or awareness than he has in the usual kind of day-to-day conversation that we have. That's where music resides for us. And I think it's just that one step closer to our soul. So as we find ourselves moved deeply by music, we are finding ourselves moved deeply at the soul level of something that is particularly beautiful. So I've thrown an awful lot of stuff at you. I'm sure Paul Fahey would love to go back and talk about my creation slides there and help me out with those. Anyway, if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Please, just speak up.
Harmar, why can't I play a horn like Wynton Marsalis?
Charlie, I couldn't quite understand you.
Why can't I play a horn like Wynton Marsalis?
It's because you operate, Charlie, like he doesn't.
How do you think about artificial intelligence now? I think you've changed my mind about worrying so much about it because of the music.
Yeah, I agree with you. I don't know that we can understand that. I think we can appreciate it. We can be deeply moved by it. And as I said, when I hear the swan, every time I hear that, wow, it's just so beautiful. But I just assume that there's something deep in my consciousness that goes way back. And I like to think of it as a way to relate to all of creation that I represent. I'm the end product of all of that. But that's why I wanted to go back to the Big Bang and to hydrogen and helium and iron and oxygen and the evolution of all the creatures that ultimately provide us a voice. And it's not just a byproduct of evolution. This is critical. It's central to our evolution, to our survival as far as we've gotten. And so I think music deserves that kind of respect and appreciation, that it is central to who we are as human beings, because it's been so important in our evolution.
Harmar,
Yeah.
a few years ago, Denise and I went to a premiere of a documentary that was done by medical groups around Harvard about the use of music, especially music that patients with dementia would have heard in their youth. And it was amazing. People who were, to all effects, catatonic when they started hearing music that they might have heard at the age of 13 or 14 or 15, were dancing and were capable of speaking. And when you go to something in Cambridge that's a premiere, of course, there's a panel of people that were involved in this speaking on the stage after the movie, after the documentary, and they were giving all of the medical insights. But it was amazing that music, in effect, short-circuited the impediments that dementia was creating for these people for language and for movement.
I think that you said two things that I think are so interesting. I'm not sure that it's short-circuited. I think it just found another part, because music is located largely in the right side of our brain and language on the left, but not always. And both involve the cerebellum. Who would have thought the cerebellum was so important in terms of the creation and the processing of music? So I think that is true. The other thing you said, they started to dance. If you look at the way our brains are constructed, the capacity for sound and larynx is also directly connected to our arms, especially arms and also legs. Listen to a baby make sound. It never does that without moving its arms. Baby always moves its arms when it goes, ooh, ooh, ooh. And so the nice way to think of it is we are song and dance people from the beginning. But those neurologic connections exist and allow us to express ourselves through movement and through sound that has nothing to do with language. Thank you. Maury.
Harmar, first, thank you for that very profound presentation in such an understandable way.
Thank you.
And of course, beyond that, for your being the father of the Schemel Forum and being so meaningfully helpful through the years. Thank you for your enormous contribution.
Thank you, Maury. Thank you, Maury.
My question is this. Do you believe that evolution of human beings has been concluded, or will there be a continued evolution in terms of capacity and ingenuity and creativity?
All of the above. Yes, we can't stop here. We have to go on. And we will. I think it's good to think of ourselves as interim. And when you do that, we could forgive ourselves for some of the awful things that we do. We have to move forward. But we can't say that this is the end product of evolution. Evolution responds to an environment too. And there's an utterly different environment that we have now than Paleolithic man and women had to survive. So I'm hoping that there's enough time for us to do that.
We're not over yet.
We're not over yet. Amen to that. Well, let's conclude the day. Thank you all for coming. It's been just great to see you. Thank you.